This is Jerry Ferguson, and I'm your instructor for International 113. And I'm going to attempt to provide some additional insight into the material from Chapter 2 for this course. I'm going to try this video approach, and if you find it beneficial, I'll attempt to proceed using it throughout the balance of the course. So let's get right into it with Chapter 2. We're dealing with cultural elements, and in that chapter, our learning objective was to understand methods of learning about cultural environments, grasping the major causes of cultural differences and changes, discussing behavioral factors influencing countries' business practices, and recognizing the complexity of cross-cultural information differences, especially in the communication that we'll have between our own personnel and the host nation. Culture is a term that we all somewhat take for granted, but for the purposes of this course, culture refers to the learned norms based on the values, attitudes, and benefits of a group of people. And that group could be a country or a region, even within a country or multiple countries. Culture is an integral part of the nation's operating environment. It's the way we process information and behave as a group of individuals. Every business function is subject to potential cultural differences. You can't avoid them, so you need to learn how to deal with them. As far as just a general information, basically cultural factors in business fall into several categories. They can be both political, cultural, environmental, or geographic. And most of them fall into those nuances. As the chart on your screen shows, there can be things such as cultural awareness, identification of dynamics of that culture, things that are unique to it, behavioral practices affecting the business, and strategies for dealing with cultural differences. These in themselves drive the objective, strategy, and the norms or means for that organization, both internationally and domestically. Companies need to decide when to make cultural adjustments. Foster cultural diversity can allow a company to gain a global competitive advantage by bringing together people of diversity backgrounds and experiences. So companies are often become more competitive or gain a competitive advantage by having an influx of new and fresh ideas. And cross-cultural exposure can also bring those kind of fresh and new ideas into the workplace. But cultural collisions can occur when a company implements practices that are less effective, or when employees encounter distress because of the difficulty in accepting or adjusting to foreign behaviors. For example, when we ran a company when we entered China for the first time, we attempted to run that company pretty much exclusively with expatriates from the United States going over to China. Some of them had some experience in China, but many did not. The way in which you deal with associates here in the United States is radically different in China, and the rules of engagement are radically different. And so there was a period where the management style of the foreign nationals and what is necessary in their culture became problematic. It was only after we learned how to deal with that and looked for help outside of our own skill set were we able to address those issues. That's the type of thing we're talking about when we talk about cultural collision. As far as cultural awareness, problem areas that can hinder managers' cultural awareness are subsequent reaction to circumstances, the assumption that all society subgroups are similar. So, for example, the fact that we entered China and we made the assumption that being a Chinese individual was generic, similar to what some people do here in the United States, was problematic. The people in Southeast China are dramatically different socially than the people in Northeast China. And you therefore need to be aware of the fact that there can be cultural differences even within a geographic country. And the assumption that all subgroups will act the same, it can be a problem. And to some extent, if you've traveled extensively, even here in the United States, you'll often find that there are some obvious differences between the way people react to situations in different parts of the United States. Managers that educate themselves about other cultures have a greater chance of success abroad. There are those individuals that are experts at being what we call expatriates, people who go and become an expert on a culture and living in that culture from a host country to a host country nation from a parent company nation. Countries such as France and England have developed an extensive inventory of individuals that have that type of experience. Part of that falls back on their colonial period when these people were living overseas for their entire lives. But you see, when you go overseas, you'll see a large number of French and British expatriates who've made a career out of dealing with cultural differences and working within other populations. The nation is a useful definition for society, but because similarly nation is a useful definition of society, but similarities among people may cause an effect of the nation's boundary, may go more than just through their boundaries. And what I'm trying to say here, I'm sorry, I'm tongue-tied, is that just because you're within the boundaries of a nation does not mean you have a coherent social group within that country, and that there aren't elements of differences. And that while we may be all part of one country, in some nations especially, those boundaries do not necessarily represent the cultural boundaries. For example, in the Middle East, one of the biggest problems that businesses and governments have in the Middle East is many of those countries were formed at the end of World War II based on political decisions by the Western allies. But in fact, those borders were not cut based on religious or social or ethical or ethnic considerations. And so in many cases, we cut entire populations in half with physical borders. As far as the cultures and the way cultures affects the way a nation state operates, often the way laws are applied within a given nation may be different. So we in the United States, trying to do business in Bangladesh, we go in with a mental expectation that law and order is applied with the same rules and guidelines, and in fact many times it is not. That's particularly been an issue in operations in China, because the Chinese perception of law and order and the rights of businesses and so forth is radically different. Language and values are shared within borders often, but they may or may not be unique to that geographic area. Rights and symbols are shared among national lines, so often you'll have subgroups that people are sensitive to what they're doing, but they may have a religious or ethnic or social drive for why their rights and symbols of their country are different, even though they're a member of the British Empire, or they're a member of the French, they're a nationality of France, but yet their ethnic group may be from some other part of the world. Country by country analysis can be difficult, and while in this course you're doing it by country, one of the things you may want to look at as you're doing your weekly assignments is, are there large social groups within your selected country that are significantly different? For example, Christian versus Muslim, or a certain race group versus another racial group, a certain social background. And because of those differences, you may have nations where it's not as clean cut a comparison as to the analytics of that country as you might expect to see here, for example, in the United States. Subcultures exist within nations. So, for example, in the United States, we're starting to see a development of a subculture, both Hispanic and Arabic, and some people are having problems dealing with that development. The United States has historically been used to homogenizing populations into a common culture. And we therefore today are dealing with that both socially and politically. Other countries, those differences can be significant, and in some cases it's created a social barrier within those countries. Similarly linked groups from different countries. So an ethnic group that may be a French citizen or a German citizen, but they perceive themselves as being from another part of the world or another social group. Managers also need to focus on relevant groups, the groups that are going to be important within the populations they're going to deal with, and their workforce is going to be drawn from. As far as we talked about in the reading about culture forms and how they handle change, cultural value systems are established early in life, but must change throughout our livelihood. So most of us, by the time we reach grammar school, have had many of our social values and systems already established by the people we are involved with. We have things such as choice of imposition, as things like cultural imperialism, where we're applying a social view of the world based on the culture in which we've been raised in. Contact with other cultures. Many of us are brought up dealing with other cultures, and therefore we've learned to be more understanding and supportive of that culture's needs and the differences. Cultural diversity and diffusion and the breakdown of cultural values are all elements that we have to deal with. Cultural diffusion, when this change results in mixing cultures' elements. So in a country like the United States, where we call ourselves a melting block, often many of us have accepted or embraced cultural factors or elements like celebrating St. Patrick's Day, when in fact we have no Irish blood in us at all. And that's called Crollism, is this concept of cross-cultural acceptance of other groups or mixing of group elements. Language. A common language within a country is a uniforming force. Historically, that's been one of the reasons why the United States has been so effective in some of their achievements, is that we share, for the most part, a common language. Again, over the last 5 to 10 years, we've started to see some erosion of that. There are studies that indicate that a significant part of our population by the year 2020 will speak Spanish rather than English as their primary language. That causes both domestic issues, but more important, it may make us more sensitive to some of the problems we deal with when we go elsewhere. For example, Americans are noted in other foreign countries as usually being less tolerant of other language, which we tend to expect people to learn English. Europeans, for the most part, speak 2 or 3 languages fluently, and yet here in the United States, we're lucky to get people to speak English fluently. Shared languages between nations facilitates international business. So, for example, the fact that we and the British speak a similar form of English, they would say we don't speak English, but that's okay. We speak enough of it that we can communicate. That makes shared business principles easier. When you start dealing with the United States and China, or Bangladesh, Malaysia, or South Africa, or South America, you start getting into language barriers, and that makes it more difficult to be successful in business. Native English-speaking countries account for 1/3 of the world's population, and historically, that's where many American businesses have focused. English is considered to be international business of law. I mean, language of business, and that may or may not be the case historically, but that's where it's at currently. Pardon me. This map attempts to show you some of the primary world's languages, and the purple right here you can see is basically nations that use English as their primary language. And then you can see others, colors. This is out of your textbook, and it reflects languages as it relates around the world. But as you can see, there's still a very large number of major languages that cover the globe. And as far as the major language groups, populations, and so forth, these charts are just designed to show you how the population breaks down relative to language versus the world population. Again, this comes out of your textbook. And if you notice, the importance of English as an international language, English represents 33% of the world's population and its primary language as it pertains to business. Okay. In the reading wheel, we're also dealing with the concept of religion and the stabilization that that can cause in the social fiber. Religion impacts almost every facet of business, even for those of us who do not necessarily practice strong religious involvement. It still impacts our daily lives. Centuries of profound religious influence continues to play a major role in the shaping of cultural values and behavior. So why we do things and so forth, that impacts our day-to-day activity. For example, McDonald's in India has introduced new and varying menus that take advantage of their focus on non-beef, pork-related foods. So they have a lot of foods that are unique to their dietary requirements, which are driven by their religious beliefs. They similarly do that in the European Union. They do it in Israel. They do it in several other countries as well. It also influences the business practices of those countries. For example, in Israel, many of the McDonald's, if not all of the ones that are owned by the corporation, are closed on Saturday because that's their religious Sabbath, and they worship accordingly that way, and therefore it impacts the business operations of that business. Many strong values are results of dominant religions. So things such as our ethical foundation, what's right and wrong, and even the rules and laws and practice and best practices that we do in business, to some extent have some merit and some root in religious philosophy. And again, this chart out of the text attempts to show you where the major world religions are prevalent. And so you'll see that there's a large number of countries that are engaged in various types of Chinese religion, various Christian religions, different forms of Islam, and so forth. The charts can be somewhat deceiving, so take that into account. What you would want to do if you were doing a pure analytics on this is not only look at the religion, but look at the population mix. So while on this chart, you might say that Chinese religion is a relatively small element of the world religion, you're doing that based on landmass and perception. When you do population, you find out that the perception of this part of the world, Southeast Asia, is dominant because of the number of people that worship in that faith. Social stratification. Social ranking is determined by an individual's achievements and qualifications and an individual's affiliations with or memberships in certain groups. And what we find is that in different parts of the world, social stratification can be dramatically different. While they've attempted to eliminate it for the most part, in some rural areas it still exists. India had a very socially driven social layering system of where they had different layers of society, and you could not move between those elements. For the most part, since they've become independent, they've attempted to get rid of that cultural status, but it still exists in some places. Elsewhere in Africa and Asia and the Middle East, there's definitely social strata, and the way you deal with a company may be impacted by that behavior within that country. While we in the United States attempt or believe that we're less socially stratified, especially from a marketing perspective, in other countries, some of that often has to be taken into account. Group affiliations can be group membership. It can be based on gender, family, age, caste, ethnic, religious, national origin. So you could have groups like Masons, groups like the pick a group. But basically, all we're saying here is some of the affiliations could be based on these type of structures. And then we can also base it on religion, political affiliations, parties, professional associations, Two other factors that are important is education and social connections. Those are both often affected, where you went to college, where you got your education from. One of the things that we struggle with as Americans especially is that our definition of our work ethics is not easily exportable to all parts of the world. So the motivation to work is different across cultures. Some cultures see work as simply the way in which you support your time off, while others see your jobs and what you do in your work as a pure definition of your worth. So the desire to work is different between cultures. In countries where material wealth is valued, there is generally a great motivation to work. And so in countries where there is not a high level of personal wealth or no personal wealth, it's social wealth, then the desire to work may not be as high. Typically, people are also more eager to work when potential rewards are high. So if you're in a culture or a country where salaries are fixed and there are no advantages for working hard, it could affect the impact of that. The study showed that the desire for material wealth is a prime motivation for work, promotes economic development. People are more eager to work when the rewards are higher. There is studies that pertain to masculinity and femininity. High masculine scores refer to living to live to work than work to live. That's some of the things they look for when they're looking at a motivational study. Hierarchical of needs is another theory that determines what motivates people to work. And we're going to look at that for a moment. That theory was professed by Maslow, who developed Maslow's hierarchy of needs. In that theory, individuals will fill lower level needs before they move on to higher levels. So if you're, and we'll see a chart in a minute that'll make that a little bit clearer. The ranking of needs is different between cultures. So what we need in the United States may not be what someone needs in Bangladesh or someone perceives the need in Southeast Asia or Africa. This is a diagram that's been developed by Maslow, and this kind of explains the hierarchical I was just talking about. So for example, in his theory, most people are going to work toward this level 1 issues. And this is going to be your food, place to live, your basic rudimentary needs as an individual, supplying food for your children, and so forth. As you solve these hierarchical needs, you then move to the next level, which is security, a nice home, living in a safe neighborhood. Then it becomes affiliation, so esteem, and then self-actualization. So as you become more and more satisfied with your situation and you're able to meet your needs, you move up through this triangle until you get to self-actualization. And the theory is that if you at any time have one of these lower levels taken away, for example, your town is flooded and all your personal property disappears, well, then you immediately focus on these lower levels at the exclusion of the upper levels. The way that we deal with each other and with individuals and with coworkers and with supervisors is radically different throughout the world. And this is what we mean by relationship preferences. And they are different between cultures. All of you are doing in your assignment this week a study that pertains to power distance. And in power distance, we're talking about high power distance implies little supervisory interaction. So in that case, the power is held by the senior, and the person at the bottom is just doing what they're told to do. It tends to be an autocratic or paternalistic management style. So I'm going to tell you what to do, and you're going to carry it out. There are cultures where that is the norm. They don't want, the individuals do not want the freedom to make choice. They don't want to have to make decisions as to what they're to do or not to do. They just want you to tell them. And that drives an autocratic type of leadership style often. Low power distance implies a consultative style of management. So in a low power country, the people in that country, they want to feel like they're part of the solution. They want to be in communication with their supervisor. They want to have a say in what their day-to-day work activity is and how they accomplish that work. These elements become critical to a business. If you're coming from a country that's a low power distance country, say for example the United States, and you're going to a country that is a high power such as China, then the leadership styles that you would use here in the United States may have challenges in China where they are looking for you to tell them what you want them to do. Individualism versus collectivism. High individualism welcomes change. It means that you want to be unique, you want to be different, you're willing to deal with it and embrace change. If you're high collectivism, prefers a safe work environment. They want to have a communistic type of organization where you don't look for the person and reward the best, you don't look for the worst and get rid of them. Everybody accepts the responsibility. It's a communion. It's a town raising the child instead of the parent taking the responsibility. Risk-taking behavior. This is an area where most companies struggle when they go into any new country, because understanding how that country and their citizens deal with risk is critical. And there's basically 4 assumptions that we can make as far as risk. And it's just necessary. You have to learn how to deal with it. And often, if there's a significant difference between your corporate strategy and the country in which you're entering, it may require you to change some of your strategic direction to be able to embrace that. So the avoidance handles uncertainty. And uncertainty avoidance is a culture where they don't want to deal with it. They want to avoid uncertainty. Trust, a degree of trust among people. In other words, what kind of trust do we have? Future orientation. Is it a culture that delays gratification and just they don't want to deal with it later? Or fatalism, attitude of self-determination. So these are types of risk avoidance or risk dealing with risk strategies, and businesses have to figure out whether or not to deal with them. If you're in a self-determination situation, they may be willing to work hard to achieve goals and take responsibility for performance, but if they're fatalists and believe that every event in life is unavoidable, they're less likely to accept the basic cause and effect relation between a work and a reward. So if they're a fatalist, it's gloom and doom. It's not gonna matter what I do. It's still gonna happen. So why should I put myself at risk? Versus a self-determinant is going to say, yeah, I can make a difference. I want to make a change. Okay. As far as information and task processing, all cultures handle information in different ways. In some cultures, it's very difficult to use the perception or clues that the people show. We as Americans often struggle with dealing with Southeast Asian cultures because of the different way they express themselves as it relates to information. Obtaining the information can often be a difficult process, and how you get that information. In a low context culture, people generally regard only first-hand information that bears directly to a subject or at hand to be relevant. So, in a low context country, if it doesn't pertain to what we're doing right now, they don't want to be bothered with it. They don't need it. Managers typically spend little time on small tasks. On small tasks, and tend to get to the point. They just want to get it done. They're not interested in all the peripheral. In contrast, the high context cultures, people see peripheral information and want to get all the data they can. They want all the information they can, whether it's direct or indirect, whether it has a direct cause or a causal activity in the event. The more information I have, the better. And so that's as far as obtaining the information. Just a second, my slide show is frozen for a minute.